Now that we have figured out the structure of the course, let us try to understand where it is that people get ideas for their apps. Some types of apps, like games, are invented by people who appear to have a certain viewpoint, a style of thinking. These are people like cartoonists and writers and so on, who have a way of thinking about the world that is not so easy for others to grasp. But many of the apps that we find useful come about from observing what people are already doing and finding out ways to do that activity better by using computers. Examples of these kinds of apps are the things that we use in daily life. For instance, there are food delivery apps like Swiggy and Zomato, taxi apps like Ola and Uber, or map and driving direction apps like Google Maps or OpenStreetMap. Once upon a time, there was something called a telephone directory. This was a big book that was delivered to you by the phone company, where you would look up the name of a restaurant, call up the restaurant, and hope that they would deliver food to you. Of course, this was limited to the restaurants that were near enough to your home. Today, the Swiggy or Zomato app with their delivery service makes it possible for us to order food from relatively distant places, and it gives us real-time updates of various stages of our order as well. It is fun to look at all the stages that happen while you are waiting for food at home. Similarly, once upon a time, you had to know about taxi service companies, you had to know their phone numbers, you would have to call them up often a day or so in advance and then book a taxi. Today, with taxi hailing apps like Ola and Uber, drivers and riders work almost directly with each other, and the middleman, the app company, is very nearly invisible to either party except when some issue arises. The creators of these apps observed a common need, saw how to implement it using apps, and built a service around this idea. Initially, these ideas were inspired by just plain copying or mimicry of existing services that were based on older technology. But as these apps and the companies building them understand the domain better and understand better how to use today's technology, the app-based alternative goes far beyond what was possible in the older service. The app that we will build in this course is based on a similar idea. We have observed a common need and we will set out to solve it and build an app that we can then make available to people as a service. So what is this app we are dealing with? The app that we have designed is called FairShare. FairShare is an app that is a service to help roommates to decide how to split up their expenses so that everyone ends up paying a fair share of all the bills that they have shared jointly. We will start with a service that solves for a very simple situation. The assumptions that we make are like this. Roommates share expenses on food, water, cable, TV, trips to the restaurant, and so on, all the activities that they might do jointly. We will assume that for every such joint activity, one person pays for the entire activity at a time. At the end of every month, each roommate can get a report that tells them who owes money and who should receive money, so that everyone ends up paying the same amount of money. As you might imagine, in time we can add more complex features to this service. For example, several people might chip in different amounts of money to a single activity instead of our assumption where only one person pays everything. Another case is that a few roommates participate in some activity instead of every single roommate participating. In that case, equal sharing applies only to those roommates, while the non-participants do not have to pay anything as far as that activity is concerned. This is not a case that our simplified scenario deals with. A third possibility is that some person defers their payment at the end of the month and will agree to pay sometime later. Our app could be adjusted to track this situation as well. There are many other such ways you can imagine in which we can make the app service far more complicated. However, In any software design situation, it is best to start small and evolve the program in time. This is why we have laid out the discussion of our app in the manner we have. It is the simple features that are easy to understand that we will begin with first. This idea of gradually growing a program instead of building it was discovered with some effort. In the early days of computing, people tried to build programs following the style used in other engineering fields. They would attempt to decide what to build, create plans, and then implement the program. The analogy they were following was with fields like civil engineering, where one draws up plans, creates blueprints, and then hires subcontractors to work on various pieces. But we discovered, by we here I mean the entire field really, discovered that it is much harder in software to decide what to build and how to build it. The reason seems to be that there is no nature or physics to impose any limits on what can and cannot be done. The result is that people end up imagining all sorts of features. And it's not just the features themselves, but the way these features interact with each other that ends up becoming immensely complicated. This is much more so than what can happen under the limits that nature creates. And so, fields which rely on nature to put boundaries in some ways have an easier time of deciding what to do because of the very limitations that exist in what can be done. Eventually, we learned that software should not be built, it should be grown. A well-known book called Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks talks about this discovery. As time went by, we found better ways to organize ourselves beyond what was discussed in Mythical Man Month. The methods that were discovered have names like XP, Scrum, Kanban, which you may have probably heard of. But whatever their details, there are things that these methods have in common, and perhaps the most important is the single lesson that says, start small, do not imagine too much upfront, get some experience with the product, and then evolve it one step at a time. A short name for this idea is minimum viable product. That word, MVP, is a play on the acronym for Most Valuable Player awards in cricket and other sports. So, as following these lessons that we have learned, we will use the same style. We will start with a very simple scenario, which is crude but it works. We then add more features that seem necessary after some experience. In each step, however, our software will always work. It is never the case that we will have a long period such that our program will work only at the end of that duration. This fits in well with our overall approach, which is to start with a command line program and end up with a modern app. So that's the general idea. The next step, having specified what it is that we plan to do, and the idea that we will start by building a minimum small app that we can understand, let's take the next step. So the next step is to understand the problem in detail. The first rule is to spend adequate amounts of time to understand the problem. What we do is we try out some of the scenarios by hand and see what the details really are like. A fancy name for what we do would be paper prototyping. This is just another way of saying that use paper to think the ideas through. Our paper prototype will be just enough that we can orient ourselves about where we are in trying these ideas out. It will help us invent the basic algorithm, and in a short while we will move on to the implementation. So to do this, let us come up with some examples. Here is our first very simple example. There are only two people, A and B, and the scenario we will understand is as follows. A pays 10 rupees first for some joint event that A and B participate in. Then A pays 20 rupees for another event, and then B pays for 40 rupees for some event that again both of them participate in. So at the end of this sequence of events, A has spent 30 rupees, B has spent 40 rupees, and the question is, how do we share equally? Notice that we have taken an extremely simple example to make sure that we will evolve the basic idea and it will work for absolutely basic situations.